Hello, and welcome back. I'm John, and you're watching Dr. Hollowed. In today's episode, we're going to be taking a look at the most horrifying things people have ever witnessed. So don't forget to like and subscribe.
I was driving home from a friend's house, following behind another friend of mine. I was talking to him on the phone for some reason and he said, "Hang on, is that someone lying in the street?" He pulled over and left his headlights on and I pulled behind him and we got out and rushed over to a man lying unconscious in the gutter. This was in a nice residential neighborhood and the man was in his early 40s and wearing jogging clothes. He was bleeding all over his head and it was running down into his eyes. My friend called 911 and we saw him take one deep, pained, agonal breath. Luckily at that time a cyclist trained in CPR and an off-duty EMT came by and began trying to resuscitate him. It did not look like he was hit by a car, but instead suffered a sudden problem, maybe a heart attack or aneurysm. After a few minutes a woman came forward and said she had seen him collapse on his own, but was out walking with 4 very young girls and had to take them home before she could do anything, and that was right when my friend and I showed up anyway. When the EMTs arrived, the man had not taken a breath in about 10 minutes. They did not seem to be in any hurry with him, though they eventually put a respirator on him and loaded him on a stretcher. I suspect they knew he was a goner and were just going through the motions for the small crowd that had formed. We never found out for sure, but it seems pretty clear that the one gasp we saw him take was his last breath. This story is a bit different, as it actually happened to me. The horrifying thing was what I saw afterwards. It was in the 4th grade at recess, and I was with a group of kids playing a stupid game by throwing a ball back and forth over a baseball dugout. The roof of the dugout was slanted upwards on our end, and we couldn't throw the ball back over. The kids on the other side were getting annoyed that we couldn't get it back to them, so they started throwing anything they could find. I was reaching down to pick up a stick to throw back at them, when suddenly I felt something hit me before I blacked out. Later on, I'd learned that a huge rock with a really sharp edge had hit me right on the top of the head, leaving a big gash all the way to my skull. I came to just a few seconds later to find blood spewing out of my head. I was probably in shock because it didn't hurt, but the sight of my own blood quickly soaking my face and shirt freaked me out and I started crying. Every other kid on the playground just stopped what they were doing and stared at me in horror. Some of the girls had to hide their eyes. 2 of the teachers ran down to pick me up and take me back to the school building. I was freaking out and asked them, "Am I gonna die?" To which one of them responded, "I don't know." That wasn't exactly the best thing to tell a kid. To this day, I'm still haunted by the sight of one of the other teachers who came out right after she said that. She just shrieked in horror and put her hands on her head. That was the first time someone had responded like that, making me realize how bad it really was. After that, I passed out again. This time it was from blood loss and shock, and I woke up in the ER. I had gotten a transfusion and also had a number of stitches put in my head. The nice part about everything after that point was that I got all the cookies and cake I wanted. I made it out fine, but the expression of everyone looking at me the day after it happened was just horrible. When I passed out right after seeing that teacher's expression, I really thought that was the end. I've been going to the same summer camp in the mountains from age 5 to about age 15. I was 10 years old when this happened. The big house was full of mostly the same kids from previous years in the camp. This year, the bungalow housed an old couple and their 2 grandchildren, Mary, who was about my age, and Katie, who was 2. Mary was awkward, so the kids weren't very nice to her. I understood what it was like being an outcast, so I tried to befriend her and her sister. Katie was the cutest, most sophisticated 2-year-old I'd ever met. She had big rosy cheeks and chunky arms and legs. She was always going off on adventures by herself and worrying the adults. It was gray and drizzly all day, so we stayed in to play video games. Mary comes rushing in to ask if anyone's seen Katie. We are all too engrossed in our Sega to pay much attention to her. Not that many people ever paid much attention to Mary. After about an hour I noticed that there's quite a commotion outside our game room. Katie has been missing for an hour now. We joined the search party. Some kids run down to the bottom of the stream to see if she fell in because she really loved to swim. That gave me an idea to check the pool. The small gate was still locked, yet she was floating face down when I got there. It seems her grandfather saw me go over there and followed behind, because the next thing I know, he's in front of me and dives in to pull her out. Her cheeks were the same icy blue as the water. The next few moments are blurred in my head. Grandfather is trying to give her CPR. The grandmother is on the ground screaming at God to take her instead. Slamming her fists on the ground till they were raw and red. The kids are all running around screaming. The remaining adults are all trying to gather the kids and shield them from seeing the body. It was her birthday that day. She turned 3. Her grandparents were celebrating when she managed to climb out her window, make it down to the pool, climb over the gate and hit her head on the railing before finally falling into the pool. One of the more psychotic kids said that he hoped she died while we were waiting for the hospital to call back. I punched him in the gut. Mary came to me that night and hugged me and started weeping. I was her only friend there, so I was expecting this. What I wasn't expecting was what she told me in between sobs. She said it's all her fault. She said that everything was her fault because she asked God for a baby sister. That was the day I stopped believing in God. I watched my mom die from cancer for about a week. 10+ years prior, she was diagnosed with melanoma skin cancer. They removed the troublesome spot and screened her every 6 months after that and found nothing. My wife and I got married in July 2008. The next month, we moved to Florida from Pennsylvania, where our family is from. In November 2008, I got a call from my mom telling me they found lung cancer. A week later, she called to tell me they found the cancer had spread to her spine and brain, but the brain lesions were small and they were hopeful about radiation and chemotherapy. Christmas 2008, my wife and I took vacation to PA to visit our family. My mom seemed to be doing relatively well. She was a bit depressed, but in as good a spirits as one can possibly be in that situation. We went bowling for my dad's birthday. As a family, we shaved my mom's head due to her hair thinning from the radiation. It granted her a sense of relief because it was a family event and she wasn't alone. A month later, she had surgery to remove part of the tumor that was putting pressure on her spine. A month after that, she had finished radiation treatment on her head and they started talking about chemotherapy and beginning radiation on her back. March 2009, just 3 months later, I got a call from my dad. My mom had a seizure Friday night due to a coronary embolism that thankfully had passed quickly and she was in the hospital. Sunday, my sister, who had been doing a lot to help take care of my mom, called me to talk to me a little bit more about the situation and that things may not be looking good, but they're not sure. That afternoon, I told my wife that I had to go home to see my mom. I booked a flight for Monday morning. Sunday night, around 11 p.m., my dad called me crying and told me that I needed to come home because he was really worried. Thankfully, I was able to tell him that I had already booked the flight. We kept my coming home a surprise for my mom, who was very lucid, but on pain medication. My pop, mom's dad, picked me up from the airport and drove me to the hospital. When I turned the corner near her room, she just happened to be looking down the hallway and saw me walking. She thought she was imagining things. I held her hand, talked to her for a little while, and then took a walk down the hallway. I lost it. 3 months prior, she was walking around, smiling, laughing. If you didn't know she had cancer, you wouldn't have a clue. Now, she laid in a hospital bed strapped to a bunch of machines, bald head from the radiation, lost probably 15 pounds. I couldn't bear to see her like that. I went back to the room and talked to her for the rest of the evening. She was tired, but had no problem holding a conversation. Overnight, things had taken a turn for the worst. She was in even more pain, so they upped her pain medication and she drifted into a moderately lethargic state, just sleeping most of the time. We woke her up when she had a visitor or when it was time for her medication, but she just slept most of the time. We spoke to the doctors about taking her home on hospice care to live out her final days in the house where she lived with my dad for over 20 years. They agreed, but said they didn't expect her to make it through the next 24 hours. That day, she was taken to our home in an ambulance and everything was set up for her care at home. We had pain medication, an oxygen machine, her lungs weren't functioning very well on their own, and lots of family and friends. Our front door wasn't locked the entire time. Friends and family were visiting to see my mom and talk to everyone. We all sat around her bed telling stories, laughing, crying, just celebrating my mom's life. 2 days later, yes, 2 more days, far beyond the not likely 24 hours they predicted, she was still fighting, but we all knew there wasn't much left. You could hear the fluid in her lungs as she breathed, a slight gurgle. About 6:30 a.m., she started to shake a bit and her breathing sounded terrible. I held her hand and told her that I loved her and that it was okay if she went. She died shortly after, surrounded by family. We all walked outside of the house to watch the sunset for a new day. A day in which my mom didn't feel pain anymore and didn't need to suffer. We had the viewing a few days later. It was a few hours. There was a line out the door of the funeral home. The funeral director said in his many years of holding funerals, he's never seen so many people show up for a viewing. She was a teacher's aide at the local junior high for years and had made an impact on so many people. Even students showed up with their parents. I'm sobbing to myself just typing out the last few paragraphs. She was 47 years old. Myself and my wife were 23 and my sister was 24. Her and my dad were married for 27 years. Mine was seeing my father dead. I was 16 going to be 17 in about a month. I was applying for a scholarship and my dad was helping me that night. I was in my room and he was walking upstairs and he said, "Night homo, he'll help you finish your essay tomorrow." He was a pretty funny guy, always making jokes. I said okay night. I went to bed sometime after. In the middle of the night I woke up to my mom calmly, but in a very scary tone say, Oscar, I need you to be strong and come upstairs." I was shaking as I've never seen my mom like that before. As I walking up the stairs I thought maybe something happened to one of my younger brothers, maybe one died in their sleep, maybe this, maybe that. As I was climbing the second set of stairs I could hear my father's alarm clock going off. As I turned the corner the sun was coming in from the window pretty strong and I couldn't see much. As I walked through the doorway my eyes came into focus and saw my father face first, naked, on the floor. It wasn't a pretty sight. His back was pure white and he had defecated and he was completely still. It's crazy still. Until you see someone dead you'll never understand. I started pacing going, oh my god, oh my god. My mom had the phone and told me we had to call 911. She called and the operator told us we needed to flip him over to see if he was really dead and what he looked like. I was scared and I pleaded no with my mom for about 15 seconds, but my mom insisted. I grabbed his cold, dead cold, leg and my mom his arm and we flipped him on his back. It was weird. It was easy to flip him as he was in rigor mortis state. He had blood all of his face and his tongue was out where it looked like he was biting his tongue to ease pain or something. His entire front side was completely purple from the blood settling in. I stood there and just looked at him in disbelief. It was seriously like a dream and it was the last time I ever saw him. The fire department came shortly after along with everyone else. They hauled him away. I ended up having a panic attack shortly after and my younger brother kept puking. He was a firefighter for Portland, Oregon for nearly 25 years and had the biggest turnout for a firefighter funeral in Portland and it was covered by the news. There were so many cars on the road that day going to the grave site that police on motorcycles had to direct traffic for nearly 20 miles. It did give me some peace to know so many people cared. It's been almost 4 years now and it's been hard this past year. I've gotten married and just had a baby boy, Ezra George G, and I've wanted him to meet my wife and son. Another really hard point was when I got hired by the city of Portland, Oregon too. I've become their lead web developer and I work with the fire bureau regularly. It sucks because I would be working with him every day. I'm just glad I was lucky enough to have such an awesome father and that I got to spend the time I did have with him. I'm an X-ray/CT tech and at one of the hospitals I worked at, we would get called down to the morgue pretty frequently for postmortems rays. The medical examiner for a fairly large area worked out of there so most of the time it was murders or suicides and they were documenting exact course of bullets, etc. I would always volunteer to go down there as this kind of stuff never bothered me too much and some of it was quite interesting. I could usually tell by what sized X-ray films they asked me to bring what parts we would be imaging and stuff. I get the message that they need someone to go down and to bring a rather odd assortment of sizes. I get down there and see me and he has a rather odd expression and while we walk over to the cooler he tells me I'm going to need a few of everything. I simply say okay as I'm following still wondering what in the hell he is talking about and he takes a very small body bag out of the cooler. Shit. He means an abuse series which is basically what we do for babies and little kids that might have been abused. It's a 2-week-old baby. He starts telling me that those rays are just a formality. The baby died because it was sleeping next to the mother in the bed and the mom rolled over onto her and suffocated her while they were both asleep. The baby had already had its organs harvested for transplant so she was really light and all sewn up. I end up getting through all this rays and stuff and then going back about my work day trying to shake it. Fast forward 4 days and I'm at the hospital where my niece is born. Everyone is giving me a hard time because I won't hold her. I couldn't even tell them why. I am an EMT/FF and I never find the dead bodies, mutilated bodies, etc. horrifying. Instead I find the family and their reactions to be the horrifying part. One of the worst things I have ever witnessed was a father, who simply called 911 because his daughter was having a good day. She was a cancer patient, DNR had already been signed, the parents and family were all at the home, waiting for their daughter's death. The dad called because, I just don't know what to do. The daughter that day, after being unconscious for months, woke up, unable to sit up due to muscle atrophy, and asked, "Daddy, what's going on?" I had 2 rookies on the truck with me. I told my crew to wait outside. I only sent them outside because the 2 rookies had begun to cry. It wasn't their crying that bothered me, it was the fact that if I saw any more crying, I was going to break down, and that was the last thing the family needed. I spent the better part of 30 minutes talking to the father, choking back tears, trying not to add to the hysteria already rampant in the home. Leaving the house, the instant I hopped into the driver's seat of the fire engine, I completely lost it. That scene was most certainly my worst. We spent the drive back to the station crying, not a dry-eyed firefighter to be found. It messed with me like no other call has before or probably ever will. I empathize with those who shared their experiences. I've created a throwaway because I'm on the friends list of many, as well as a local subreddit, and I like to keep my private life private. I share this only to possibly steer people away from trouble. Years ago, I was on and around hard drugs all the time. Mostly MDMA and heroin. The core group I was around consisted of 8 girls and myself, a male. Girls, you say? They weren't your normal females. A few of them had their master's degree, all were very well educated. One of them was especially cynical, we'll call her Kathy. Kathy was fucking disgusting, and completely heartless. Someone once did her wrong, we'll call her Jane. In fear that Jane would rat her out, costing her hundreds of thousands of dollars in jail time, Kathy decided to take action. Kathy had lots of money and no conscience. To discredit her, it was all dirty. She also wasn't afraid to take a life. After she did some research, she lured her to a relatively empty part of the state where money was difficult to come by. Unfortunately, I didn't drive at the time as I was young and under the wing of this cynical heartless bitch. I didn't know what was really going on at the time, but many coked out 13-year-olds really have no clue most of the time anyway. After drugging Jane and clubbing her in the back of the head, I watched from a crack in the door in the motel we were at, thus knocking her out. Kathy said we had to bring her to the hospital as she didn't mean to do what she did. She suggested that I should take a nap. I kept complaining I was tired, but I declined because I felt horrible to what happened to Jane. I said that if I got tired I'd just fall asleep in the car. Kathy acting suspicious and overly paranoid, which was strange for her to show any emotion, I climbed in the back seat and closed my eyes, pretending to sleep. Kathy ended up driving past the hospital, and an hour away from the nearest town to a junkyard. I had no idea what was going on or where we were or what was going on. When I did end up opening my eyes from my false slumber, I saw a cash exchange between Kathy and a male, and the male driving off. I was like, okay, a drug deal or she's buying me a car. Kathy returned to the car as I was returning to my slumber since she was coming, to only drag Jane to an old, rusted 90-olds. She put Jane in the passenger's seat, and got in the driver's seat and drove it onto a ramp, or so it looked. When I looked closer, it was an EZ Crusher. I had no idea what was going on, or what was taking so long. I thought it was all a prank on Jane. Quite some time passed from driving the car onto the EZ, or so it seemed, when Jane finally regained consciousness. All I could hear was loud, ear-shattering and audible screeching, the engine of the EZ Crusher and crackling from the steel being crushed. I assumed that Jane was handcuffed to the inside of the car, which is why she was unable to escape, which doesn't surprise me, as Kathy loved restraining people and watching them suffer. That terrifying scream and the sound of crushed steel is forever audible to me and something I wish I could forget. When there is a car accident scene in a movie, I go back to that day. If I can anticipate or no one is coming, I often skip or excuse myself during that time. Almost 8 years have passed, been sober for 4. I never got the full story of Jane or who she was. I asked some of the people I could consider friends at the time and they didn't even know that it occurred. Kathy is now in another country, I presume, and has been for quite some time. I keep tabs with one other person from those days, and she is unaware of whatever happened to her. As for Jane, I've looked on missing persons reports around the time that all this happened, and I can't seem to match a face. I figure nobody is going to read this, but I hope someone does and is steered away from trouble or violence that they may have allowed themselves to either be a part of or witness, and take action to not allow things like this to happen. Probably too far down to read at this point, but here we go. I went out fishing with my dad when I was 10 or 11 years of age, excited by the various sea life poking their heads out of the water, as if to magnify my curiosity to this relatively unknown world. When we got out to the fishine grounds, commercial fishing, my father decided to let me run amok on a sandbar at low tide. Oh, the joy it was, scaring thousands upon thousands of seagulls into the air, only to have them rain shit upon me, like locusts of the plague. I didn't care too much, cleaned off my hat, and continued beach combing. I reached the far side of the sandbar, and what I discovered still haunts my dreams. As my boyish self prodded at the various sticks and debris that had washed up on shore, I came upon the end of a gillnet. As I followed the gillnet further down the shore, I noticed a mass of flies swarming starting to envelop me. I continued on, my bravado peaking. I discovered what exactly was causing the flies to swarm as they did. A man, his face familiar to me, although virtually eaten off by the aquatic powers that be, had gotten tangled in his net, and more than likely drowned while he was fighting to get out. I noticed his left hand was still clenched around a Victorinox knife, and by the time the reality of the situation hit me, I saw a crab coming out of his empty eye socket. I ran back to my dad's boat, as it was beached on the far side of the bar. I told him what I saw, he checked it, and called the Coast Guard in. Turns out it was one of the newer Russian fishermen that came into town. He was fishing right in the middle of the breakers, huge fucking waves, in bad weather, and his boat capsized. In Guatemala on a mission trip back in my believing days. My group made the 4-hour drive from the compound in the city to the village where we'd be staying and building chicken coops and such. A village of about 13 families. We stayed for 3 nights to get an idea of what needed to be done and to experience the lifestyle a bit. Then we drove back for 2 nights to get proper supplies, stock up food and water, etc. The morning that we are packed and set to go, we receive word that the majority of the villagers had attended a wedding a few villages away. They had hitchhiked / used whatever bits of money they had / traded tortillas for a ride in a big open back semi-type truck. And that truck went too fast on a curve and fell down a hill, with people flying out left and right. We left ahead of schedule and made way to the hospital closest to the village. As the head adults go in, I was put in charge, since I spoke the best Spanish of the people not going into the hospital, of going to the nearby pharmacies and buying as much ibuprofen, gauze, etc. as possible. We scrambled around and found the supplies at various little stores. When me, my younger brother, and 2 other guys from my church, get back to the bus, the villagers were being brought out of the hospital. Out of about 30 that had been on the truck, 9 had died, including 2 kids. We climbed into the back of our bus with the supplies, clothes, guitar, etc. and let the injured sit in the seats. We made them sandwiches from the back of the bus since they hadn't eaten in 2 days and helped clean their bandages since the hospital was unable to keep them. We got a doctor from another village and added him to our crew. When we returned to the village, those who had stayed behind, mostly women, ran to help the injured, discovering quickly who hadn't made it back. A number of wives fell to their knees with that gut-wrenching cry that only a new widow and mother of 6 can make. With her children trying to hug her but unsure why mommy was crying. Everyone had burns, some had broken bones, and others had severe injuries. But the most horrifying thing I ever witnessed came a few days later when one of the women from the accident, who had lost her husband, gave birth. It was a stillborn. And she held it in her arms, rocking back and forth, crying out for hours on end. She was one of the few people in the village who spoke Spanish. The rest spoke only a tribal dialect, so I was able to understand what she was saying. A grieving mother / widow is devastating to hear.